Kale's ship descended through the turbulent layers of Earth's atmosphere, the buffeting less mechanical and more organic than he'd anticipated. His first glimpse of the planet was a patchwork of daunting oceans and sprawling green, much more vivid than the simulations back on Zillera. David stood at the designated landing site in the Amazon rainforest, peering up as the alien vessel pierced the cloud cover. He checked his watch, synchronized to the exact moment of touchdown, and marveled at the punctuality of interstellar travelers. As Kale's ship settled on the damp earth, steam rose around it, mingling with a morning mist. The hatch opened with a hiss, and a figure emerged, stepping cautiously onto the foreign soil. David waved, a gesture he hoped would be understood as friendly. "Welcome to Earth, Kale," David called out as the figure approached. He extended his hand, a universal sign of peace, he hoped. Kale hesitated, observing the gesture, then mimicked it, clasping David's hand. "Thank you, David. Your planet is more vibrant than I expected." David chuckled. "Wait till you see the wildlife. But first, let's get you settled. There's a research station just a short walk from here." They walked through the dense underbrush, the sounds of the forest vibrant around them. Kale glanced around, visibly trying to record every detail. "Your file says you're an anthropologist," David started, breaking the silence. "What exactly does that entail on Zillera?" "I study civilizations, how beings interact with their environment and each other. And now how they manage on a Class 14 Deathworld," Kale responded, his tone mixed with professional curiosity and a hint of anxiety. David laughed softly. "Deathworld sounds so dramatic. We just call it home. Sure, it's got its quirks, but you'll get used to it." As they reached the research station, a modest building camouflaged by the surrounding flora, another human, Marco, stepped out. He was David's colleague, a biologist with a keen interest in alien flora and fauna. "Kale, this is Marco," David introduced. "Pleasure to meet you," Marco said, extending his hand as well. Kale greeted him with less hesitation this time. "The pleasure is mine. I'm eager to learn from both of you." "First lesson," Marco chimed in, "never touch anything without asking. Half the plants here don't play nice with human skin, let alone alien." Kale nodded, taking in every word. Inside, the station was lined with monitors and equipment, buzzing and blinking softly. David showed Kale to his room, a small, clean space with a view of the river. "You'll find Earth quite different at night," David mentioned as he handed Kale a small communicator. "This will keep you connected with us in case you decide to wander." "Wander?" "On a Class 14 Deathworld." Kale arched an eyebrow, his voice laced with humor. "Exactly," Marco laughed from the doorway. "That's when the real fun begins." Kale settled in, looking out the window at the flowing river, pondering the alien stars hidden by daylight. Earth, with all its dangers and wonders, was already challenging everything he knew. And deep down, he sensed this journey would change him in ways he couldn't yet fathom. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the dense canopy of the Amazon, Kale and David prepared for their first expedition into the rainforest. The air was thick with humidity and the distant calls of birds and howler monkeys. "Ready to meet the locals?" David asked as he handed Kale a lightweight backpack filled with essentials. Kale adjusted his gear, clearly excited. "Absolutely. I'm particularly interested in observing your methods of interaction with such a dynamic environment." The two set off, Marco joining them with a grin. "I'm just here to make sure you two don't get eaten," he joked, locking the station behind him. As they trekked deeper into the forest, the sounds and smells intensified. David stopped occasionally to point out various plants and insects, explaining their ecological roles and survival mechanisms. "This one here," David pointed at a large leaf covered in tiny hairs, "is called a stinging nettle. Harmless to look at, but touch it and you'll regret it for days." Kale observed from a safe distance. "Fascinating defense mechanism. Does everything on Earth defend itself so aggressively?" "Pretty much," Marco laughed. "It's not easy living on a death world." Their path eventually led to a riverbank where a group of capybaras grazed peacefully. David crouched down, staying at a distance, and gestured for Kale to do the same. "These are capybaras. Largest rodents on Earth," David whispered. "Completely harmless. They show that not everything here is out to get you." Kale was intrigued, taking several photos. They seemed quite serene amidst the chaos of their environment. "It's all about balance," Marco added. "They adapt and thrive, just like us." As they continued, they encountered a troop of monkeys swinging playfully from the trees. Kale was amazed at their agility and social structures. Observe their interactions, David suggested. There's a lot to learn about their social hierarchy and communication. Kale nodded, making notes on his device. It's similar to some species on Zillura, yet so distinctly evolved. Their discussion was suddenly interrupted by a rustling nearby. A large jaguar emerged from the underbrush, its gaze fixed on the river, unaware or uninterested in the human observers. Stay absolutely still, David instructed under his breath. Kale held his breath, watching as the jaguar stalked a drink of water and then slipped away as silently as it had appeared. Was that dangerous? Kale asked once the jaguar was out of sight. Could have been, Marco replied. But like us, it prefers peace when it can get it. Conflict is expensive, energetically. I see, Kale murmured, his respect for Earth's creatures deepening. The rest of the day passed with more mild encounters and discussions about Earth's biodiversity. As they headed back to the station, the sky turned a brilliant orange and red at sunset. This planet is relentless, yet there's an undeniable beauty in its tenacity, Kale admitted, his earlier anxiety replaced by a budding reverence. Earth has a way of doing that to you, David agreed. It shows you its teeth, then its heart. As they reached the station, Kale felt a profound sense of accomplishment. His first real day on Earth had exposed him to its dangers, but more importantly, to its intrinsic beauty and complexity. Tomorrow, we'll show you some of the plants we use for medicine, Marco said as they cleaned their gear. You'll see, there's a lot of healing here, too. Kale nodded, eager to continue his earthly education. The day had been a vivid introduction to a world that was as lethal as it was lush, and he was beginning to understand the paradoxical nature of this so-called Deathworld. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy, casting a dappled glow over the breakfast table where David, Marco, and Kale gathered to plan the day's journey. Today, we focus on ethnobotany, the use of plants in traditional medicine here, David explained, spreading out a map on the table. Many of the remedies developed from the rainforest are used globally now. Kale, who had been taking meticulous notes, looked intrigued. On Zillura, we have similar practices, but the flora is less intense. Marco chuckled as he packed several sample containers. You'll find Earth's flora not only intense, but ingeniously adaptive. Let's see if we can find some curare vines today. They're particularly interesting. As they set out, the forest seemed to welcome them with its chorus of wildlife. Their path took them near a cluster of large trees where Marco stopped. See this tree here? It's a cinchona tree. The bark is used to make quinine, an anti-malarial drug. Saved countless lives, especially in regions plagued by malaria, Marco explained, peeling off a small piece of bark for Kale to examine. Kale held it up to the light, observing its texture and smell. Fascinating. The interdependence of species and their environment is so vivid here. David led the way to a denser part of the forest. The curare vine is a bit trickier to find. It's used by indigenous people for hunting, but it has to be used carefully. The compounds can be lethal. Kale listened intently as Marco showed him how the vine was processed into a muscle relaxant, safe in small doses. It's all about the dosage, Marco emphasized. Nature's own double-edged sword. They continued deeper into the forest, collecting samples and discussing their uses. Kale was particularly impressed by the symbiotic relationships between the plants and the indigenous practices that had evolved around them. Humans have always had a knack for turning adversity into advantage, David mused as they took a break by a small stream. What might seem hostile at first can often be a source of healing. Kale nodded, adding, It's the same on Zillura, though I believe we have much to learn from how you utilize and respect these resources. As the afternoon waned, they prepared to head back. Kale stopped by a brightly colored flower, its hues a stark contrast against the green backdrop. What's this? He asked, gesturing to the flower. That's a heliconia. Not medicinal, but a good example of mutualism with pollinators. It's all interconnected, David replied. The walk back was filled with more discussions on Earth's ecological lessons and how they could be applied or contrasted with Zilluran principles. Kale was quick to draw parallels, which led to deeper conversations about conservation and sustainability. By the time they reached the station, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. Kale felt a profound connection to Earth, not just as a visitor, but as a learner. That's quite a first lesson in Earth's pharmacy, Kale said, genuinely impressed. Marco laughed, patting him on the back. Wait until you see what we have planned for tomorrow. David locked up their samples and checked his data pads. Yeah, tomorrow we tackle some of the more aggressive flora. It's not all healing and harmony, but it's all Earth. Kale looked forward to it, his earlier apprehensions replaced by a voracious curiosity. He realized that every plant, every creature he encountered, taught him not only about Earth but also about the potential for understanding vastly different worlds. As they turned in for the night, the forest around them buzzed with the secret life of a world that was as deadly as it was life-giving. The dawn chorus of the Amazon was a cacophony of sounds that seemed to sing of the untamed life hidden beneath its emerald canopy. David, Kale, and Marco gathered their gear for another day's expedition, this time to study some of the Amazon's predatory plants and the creatures that interacted with them. Today we'll be exploring a bit more about the balance of predator and prey, plant and pollinator, David said as they headed out from the station. The air was heavy with moisture, and the ground squelched under their boots. Marco took the lead, cutting a path through the dense underbrush. First up is the pitcher plant area. It's a bit of a hike, but it's worth it. As they walked, Kale was visibly more at ease, his initial wariness of the forest's dangers now tempered with an understanding of its rhythms. Your world continues to amaze me, David. The sheer diversity is unlike anything we have on Zillera. David smiled, swatting away a persistent mosquito. Yeah, Earth doesn't hold back. But it's not just about the dangers here. It's about the balance. You'll see. Reaching a clearing, they stopped by a cluster of large pitcher plants. Marco explained, these plants have evolved to trap insects, but they also provide a habitat for some amphibians. It's all about give and take. Kale bent down, inspecting a pitcher. A deadly home, yet a home nonetheless. They spent the morning taking samples and observing the interactions around the pitcher plants. Kale was particularly interested in the symbiotic relationships, noting how each species adapted to leverage the others for survival. After a light lunch by a nearby stream, David turned the conversation to more personal reflections. Being out here teaches you a lot about yourself, too. It's not just about the science. Kale nodded, looking thoughtful. I've noticed that. There's a clarity that comes with being so close to the cycle of life and death. Marco, overhearing the conversation, joined in. It's the ultimate teacher. Out here, you can't help but reflect on your own place in the universe. As they packed up to head to a different area, David shared a story about his first encounter with an anaconda, a moment that had terrified yet fascinated him. Kale listened intently, the story bringing them closer as he shared his own experiences of close encounters on Zillera. The first time I encountered a vixen beast, I was alone. It was terrifying, but it taught me a lot about fear and awe, Kale recounted. The afternoon passed with more explorations and exchanges of stories. They studied a group of venomous frogs, careful to maintain a safe distance while discussing the chemical properties of their toxins. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, they made their way back to the station. The conversations had woven a thread of camaraderie among them, grounded in their shared experiences under the vast canopy. That's the thing about Earth, David said as they neared the station. It's raw, sometimes harsh, but there's a profound beauty in how everything connects. Makes you appreciate the little things. Kale agreed, his understanding deepened not only by the ecological lessons, but also by the personal stories exchanged throughout the day. It's the same with people, isn't it? Our stories connect us, just like these species connect with each other. They arrived back at the station as the last light faded, feeling a sense of fulfillment from the day's adventures, and the bonds formed not just through shared knowledge but through shared experiences and vulnerabilities under the Earth's vibrant canopy. As twilight descended over the Amazon, casting a serene glow through the dense forest, David, Marco, and Kale prepared for a night expedition, a different kind of journey that promised to unveil the nocturnal secrets of the jungle. Most of the jungle's creatures are nocturnal. The night is when the forest truly comes alive, David explained as they checked their headlamps and gear. Kale adjusted his night vision goggles, a hint of excitement in his voice. I'm eager to experience this other side of Earth's wilderness. Marco grinned, leading the way with a flashlight. Just stick close and keep the noise down. We might get lucky and spot some of the more elusive animals. The chorus of nocturnal insects was deafening as they ventured deeper into the darkness. Every step seemed to stir up new sounds, rustles, calls, and the occasional splash of water. Listen, David paused, signaling them to halt. Ahead, the faint glow of their lights caught the reflective eyes of an ocelot. It watched them curiously, not fleeing, its eyes glinting in the artificial light. It's beautiful, Kale whispered, barely audible over the buzz of the forest. They're usually shy. We must have caught it off guard, Marco whispered back, taking a few cautious steps forward. The ocelot, deciding they were not a threat, turned and vanished into the underbrush. As they continued, David pointed out various insects and small creatures that thrived under the cover of darkness. Each has adapted in unique ways to survive here. It's all about finding your niche. Kale nodded, noting each observation carefully. It's a whole different world at night. On Zillera, our nights are quiet, almost dormant. They reached a small clearing where fireflies began their luminous dance. The tiny lights blinked randomly, creating a mesmerizing display of natural fireworks. It's like a light show, Kale remarked, his face lit by the gentle glow of fireflies. Yeah, it's one of my favorite parts of the jungle, Marco said, setting up a small device to record the light patterns. As they made their way back through a different path, a sudden rustle in the bushes made them stop in their tracks. A large capybara crossed the path, followed by a noisy troop of youngsters. Even the biggest rodent in the world seems less intimidating when it's just a family out for a walk, David joked softly, watching the capybara family disappear into the foliage. Kale laughed, the sound blending into the night. There's a gentleness to it that's unexpected, considering the day's lessons about predators and defenses. The way back was less eventful, but the sounds of the night seemed to envelop them in a natural symphony. When they finally saw the lights of the station, they were reluctant to leave the magic of the forest night. As they removed their gear, David turned to Kale. It changes your perspective, doesn't it? Seeing how life adapts and thrives in all conditions. Kale nodded, his earlier apprehensions replaced by a deep fascination. It does. It's humbling and profoundly beautiful. That's the jungle for you, Marco added as they stepped inside. It teaches you to look, to listen, and to respect. Back inside, as they shared a late snack, the conversation drifted from scientific observations to reflections on their own lives and the quiet revelations of the night. Kale, feeling a connection to both the earth and his companions, expressed his gratitude. Tonight was an enlightening experience. Thank you for sharing this part of your world with me. David smiled, clapping Kale on the shoulder. Glad you enjoyed it. The night has a way of making everything seem more connected, more alive. As they turned in for the night, the echoes of the jungle's nocturnal life continued to whisper through the walls, a reminder of the untamed and mysterious beauty that thrived in the darkness. The morning light brought a refreshing clarity to the research station, and with it came a rare communication from Zillera for Kale, causing an unexpected stir in his usually calm demeanor. David noticed his friend's apprehension as he approached with his own communicator in hand. Something on your mind? David inquired, handing Kale a cup of coffee. Kale sighed, looking at the device. It's from my council. They're questioning the preliminary data I sent, concerned about my findings, and the time I'm spending studying human culture. David frowned, understanding the pressure of satisfying distant superiors. Do they not see the value in what you're learning here? It's not that, Kale replied, shaking his head. It's more about the concept of Earth being a Class 14 Deathworld, and yet having such rich biodiversity and cultural depth. They find it hard to reconcile. Marco joined them, overhearing the last part. Sounds like they need a bit of Earth-style perspective. What if we show them more about how we coexist with our environment? Maybe some live data or interactive sessions. That could work, Kale pondered the idea. Seeing Earth's ecological strategies in real time might help them understand. Let's set up some live feeds today, David suggested enthusiastically. We'll show them everything from the predatory plants to the symbiotic relationships. It'll be like they're here with us. The day was spent setting up various recording devices in strategic locations they had visited over the past days. David and Marco explained each setup to Kale, who coordinated with his team back on Zillera to ensure the live feed worked seamlessly. As they worked, they continued their discussions on Earth's unique ecological aspects. Kale was particularly keen on showing how humans actively worked to preserve what they could of these natural systems, despite the inherent dangers. Here, Marco pointed out as they set up near the pitcher plants, these might be of particular interest. They're a prime example of Earth's hostile nature being perfectly balanced with its necessity for life. Kale nodded, recording a detailed commentary for his peers back home. On Zillera, our plants are more passive. Nothing like the active predation seen here. As the day turned into evening, they tested the live connection, sending through the first streams of data and images. Kale's communicator buzzed with immediate feedback. They're intrigued, he smiled, reading messages from other Zilleran scientists. The visual evidence is shifting perspectives already. That's great news. David clapped Kale on the back. Sometimes seeing is believing. They decided to conclude the day with a discussion streamed back to Zillera, where Kale, David, and Marco shared insights about Earth's resilience and adaptability. The session was interactive, with questions being posed by Zilleran scientists that led to deeper explanations about human environmental strategies and the philosophical shifts necessary to appreciate Earth's complexities. It's about understanding that balance and respect are key, David explained during the stream. We've learned to thrive by recognizing the value of what surrounds us, even the dangers. Kale ended the session with a heartfelt note. Your openness to this new understanding reflects not just scientific curiosity, but a willingness to embrace complexity and diversity. Thank you. As they shut down the equipment, the three sat back, watching the sun set over the canopy. The feedback from Zillera was overwhelmingly positive, and Kale felt a surge of pride for both his home and his current place on Earth. Seems you've given them quite a lot to think about, Marco noted with a grin. More than that, Kale responded, looking at his friends. I've shown them a new way to view life itself. And it's all thanks to this planet and its people. The day's efforts had not only bridged terrestrial and extraterrestrial understandings, but it also cemented a deeper camaraderie among the trio. Earth, with all its perils and wonders, was now a shared link between worlds previously separated by light years and skepticism. After a long day filled with technical setups and profound discussions, David suggested a change of scenery for the evening. How about a break from the tech? There's a place up north by the mountains. It's completely different from the rainforest. Might do us all some good. Kale, feeling the weight of his responsibilities ease slightly from the successful day, agreed. That sounds perfect. A chance to see more of Earth's landscapes would be most welcome. Marco was quick to organize the trip, eager for a bit of adventure himself. It's settled then. We'll head to the cabin early tomorrow. It's peaceful there, just the sky, the mountains, and a whole lot of quiet. The next morning, they packed a light vehicle with essentials and set off from the research station. The drive took them through winding roads bordered by towering trees, eventually giving way to open skies and rugged terrain. The mountains have their own stories, David shared as they drove, the peaks looming large ahead. Different ecosystems, different challenges. Kale watched with rapt attention as the environment transformed. It's like entering another world. Zillera doesn't have such drastic changes in landscape. As they reached the cabin, nestled in a quiet valley surrounded by mountains, the tranquility of the place was palpable. The air was cooler, and the sounds of the jungle were replaced by the soft whispers of the wind. They spent the day exploring the area, with David pointing out local flora and fauna that managed to thrive in the harsher climate. The discussions were lighter, filled with anecdotes and shared experiences. As evening approached, they returned to the cabin, where a fire pit outside offered a perfect spot for further conversation. Marco set up the fire, and soon, they were all sitting around it, the flames casting a warm glow against the growing darkness. It's easy to forget the rest of the universe when you're here, Marco said, handing out drinks. Kale nodded, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. Yet, these moments remind me of home. The quiet nights, the stars. It's universal, isn't it? David leaned back, looking up at the star-filled sky. Yeah, it reminds us that no matter how different our worlds are, there are things that connect us, basic elements of life and existence. The conversation drifted to the topic of relationships, how individuals from different backgrounds and worlds find common ground. Kale was curious about human connections, their complexities and simplicities. Relationships here can be as complex as the ecosystems, David mused. But at the core, it's about understanding, sharing experiences, and sometimes about the moments of silence we share, just like this. Kale considered this, his thoughts turning to his own people and their ways of connecting. On Zillera, we bond over shared duties, common goals. But here, with you, it's been about shared moments of discovery and understanding. Marco smiled, throwing another log on the fire. Maybe that's the real discovery here, not the plants or animals, but the bonds that form in the face of the vast unknown. As the night deepened, they continued to share stories, the fire crackling in rhythm with their laughter and reflective silences. The dance of flames seemed to mirror their ongoing dance of cultures, distinct yet drawn together, each learning from the other. Eventually, they retired to the cabin, the warmth of the fire replaced by the warmth of newfound respect and camaraderie. Kale lay awake for a long time, pondering the unexpected turns of his mission, now not just an observer of Earth, but a participant in its myriad mysterious ways. The night passed peacefully, with each man introspective yet united under the same distant stars. The final morning at the cabin greeted David, Marco, and Cale with a crisp, clear dawn. The mountains stood majestic in the early light, a silent testament to the enduring nature of the earth. They packed their belongings into the vehicle, the air between them filled with a bittersweet sense of closure. As much as I'd love to stay longer, I have to prepare my final report for Zillera, Cale mentioned as he folded his clothes, his voice tinged with reluctance. David, securing the last of their gear, nodded. We'll make sure your last day here counts. Let's head back and get everything ready for your journey home. The drive down from the mountains was quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts, the landscape rolling by as a visual reminder of their shared experiences. Once back at the station, Cale organized his notes and samples with meticulous care, occasionally pausing to look over at David and Marco. You know, Cale finally broke the silence. I came here with the intention of studying Earth, but I'm leaving with so much more than data. I'm leaving with friendships that I never expected. Marco, labeling some of the samples, smiled. And we gained an understanding of Zillera and a friend from another world. It's more than we could have asked for. David walked over with a digital storage device, loaded with all the data and personal notes they had compiled for Cale. Here, everything you might need for your report, plus some extras. Photos, recordings of our talks, a bit of everything. Cale accepted it, his gratitude evident. Thank you, both of you. This will be invaluable. As they worked, they discussed Cale's upcoming presentation to his superiors on Zillera. He planned to advocate for a deeper, more nuanced understanding of Earth, proposing ongoing exchanges and studies. I'll argue that Earth should not just be labeled as a Class 14 Deathworld, Cale explained, his eyes bright with determination. It's a world rich with life, lessons, and potential allies. Just remember to tell them about the capybaras. Marco joked, lightening the mood. And the fireflies, David added, chuckling. Late in the afternoon, with Cale's departure looming, they decided to take one last walk through the nearby forest. The path was familiar, each landmark a memory of their first days exploring together. Stopping by a particularly lush overlook, Cale turned to his friends. I used to think my world was complex, but Earth has taught me about different kinds of complexity and beauty. I hope I can return one day. You got a place here anytime, Cale. And maybe one day we'll visit Zillera, David said, clapping Cale on the back. As ambassadors of Earth, huh? Marco mused, the idea appealing to him. Why not? Cale smiled, the idea not so far-fetched anymore. They made their way back to the station as the sun began to set, painting the sky with colors that seemed to capture the essence of their time together, vibrant, fleeting, and deeply memorable. Back at the station, they shared a final meal, the conversation easy, but the underlying goodbye harder to ignore. When the time came, Cale hugged each of his friends, promising to keep in touch and pushing for more interstellar cooperation. Farewell, not goodbye, David said as Cale stepped into the transport vehicle that would take him to his departure point. Farewell, not goodbye, Cale echoed, his voice steady but his heart heavy as the vehicle began to pull away. Watching the lights disappear into the growing night, David and Marco felt a profound sense of accomplishment and melancholy. A friend was leaving, but the journey they had shared would continue to resonate, shaping their lives and work in ways they had yet to realize.